Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome along to another of our webinars. It's a beautiful day here in Dublin. I hope it's lovely where you are. I suspect it's also very nice where Peter is there in Sligo. Welcome aboard, Peter. We're delighted to support Peter Boland and the work of the Alliance, which Peter tells me is now getting into its 5th year now, I think, Peter. Wasn't it January 2018 that the Alliance was first established? And look, I think I was thinking about this earlier on and thinking in the days of ever increasing prices and the talks of inflation and fuel cost increases and all that sort of thing, wasn't it a great pleasure to go online the other week and find that when I renewed my car insurance with my 2 young teenage kids on it, that it actually dropped from one year to the next, which was a big delight to go into, but clearly not the case across all areas of insurance. And I know that Peter will be updating us during the course of the next sort of 45 minutes or so in terms of where insurance currently sits. What I do know is that we're delighted to be part of the Alliance for Insurance Reform, working with Peter. We have been since its inception, and I know that having attended a number of Peter's meetings and certainly been part of a number of conversations with Peter, that there's a great deal of lobbying that's gone on with government, and that there's been a lot of input from Peter and his people in terms of the review of the Personal Injuries Assessment Board, areas like duty of care, some of the defamation cases, and also increasing the number of underwriters that there are in the Irish market. But anyway, Peter's going to go through some of this. If there's any questions, please drop them into the chat box and we'll have a bit of a Q&A at the end of it. But for now, I'd like to introduce and hand over to Peter Boland from the Alliance of Insurance Reform. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Duncan, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to Retail Excellence again. Needless to say, we're a sum of our parts at the Alliance, and I'll get into our membership in a minute, but Retail Excellence have been critical to the ongoing work of the Alliance and hopefully the ongoing success of the Alliance. And it's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you today. I'm going to stick up a couple of slides and I hope you can all see these. I chose the graphic for the first page of this quite carefully because essentially we are coming to a fork in the road when it comes to our campaign. And I know that because we have prior experience. There was an Alliance for Insurance Reform back in 2002, 2003, when we previously had an insurance crisis. I, at the time, was marketing director for Supermax, and my then boss, Pat McDonough, was very engaged on the issue of insurance. So he set up the original Alliance and I ran it. He's not involved actively this time around, but I was asked by various members from the first Alliance to set up the second Alliance, and so here we are. And when I say we have hindsight, we thought we'd done a pretty good job back in 2002, 2003. We came in, we flapped around a bit, created a bit of noise, and as it happens, some changes were in train at that stage in terms of the establishment of PIAB, the Personal Injuries Assessment Board, and the commencement of the Civil Liability and Courts Act of 2004. And it all looked fairly good. So we went back to our day jobs, only to discover 10 years later that we'd left the pitch too early. And we have no intention of doing that again. So that's one of the forks in the road that I mean. And that I represent in this graphic. There are one or two more that I'll talk to as we get on through the presentation. So what I'm going to be talking about today, first of all, if I can get this page to move on, yeah, there we go, is our membership, just to give you an outline of where we are on that, because it's quite some time since I spoke to members of Retail Excellence. I'm going to get to the meat of the presentation, which is an update on progress, and then start a bit of crystal ball gazing, look at the immediate future and where we see things developing, and the longer time for insurance reform and the Alliance. So first of all, in terms of our membership, when I last presented, we had, I think, about 17 or 18 member organisations. We now have 47. I don't take an enormous amount of pleasure out of that, because essentially that means 47 civic and business organisations whose members are struggling with the issue of insurance, which frankly is farcical. I had a long conversation with Sport Ireland, one of our members, last week about this specific issue, and they have had a series of meetings with their European counterparts over the last few weeks, who could not believe that insurance was an issue, never mind an existential issue, for sports bodies and sports clubs in Ireland. And the same applies right across the spectrum. And we have many members who have either sister companies or sister organizations abroad, and have the luxury of having numbers to compare the situation, and nobody compares to us when it comes to insurance. And as a representative of the European Commission said to me 2 years ago, telling me that insurance is an existential issue is like telling me that your photocopying bill is an existential issue. It just doesn't compute with other European economies. And so we have 47 members, two who joined us recently, bringing us up to that number. Those organizations in turn have 55,000 member bodies who employ 700,000 employees, represent 622,000 volunteers and 374,000 students. And it's worth remembering that firstly, we have only one aim, which is to get insurance costs down to affordable levels and keep them that way. And secondly, to get it done quickly. So I'm in the somewhat unique position of being employed to put myself out of a job. And frankly, the sooner it happens, the better for all of us. So I'm going to take you through a quick update on where we are in terms of progress. Right now, all of what's happening from an insurance reform perspective needs to be looked at through the prism of the Cabinet subgroup on insurance reform. This was set up on the back of the programme for government when the current government came into power, which happened on the back of extensive lobbying by ourselves and our members, which was reflected in the election promises of several of the main parties, and subsequently led to the establishment of the Cabinet subgroup. What's useful about this Cabinet subgroup is that it contains most of the key ministers in this area. Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, Minister for Justice Helen McEntee, Minister for Finance Pascal Donoghue, Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform Michael McGrath, Minister Roderick O'Gorman is also a member. We haven't met him yet. He has responsibility obviously for children, among other things. And then two key ministers of state, Sean Fleming, who has direct responsibility for insurance, and Robert Troy, who has responsibility for the Personal Injuries Assessment Board, among other things. So they're a key group, and even better from our perspective, the Taoiseach very much put his name to this initiative. He's committed on a number of occasions on his own social media accounts to getting this issue sorted, and we value that commitment, and we expect him to deliver on it. What is useful about this programme is that it has identified precisely the same reforms that we believe are important. Now, occasionally they will engage in box ticking. There are 66 reforms, I think it is, in the plan. As it stands, only 3 or 4 of those are going to make any real difference, and they're the ones that I'll be focusing on today. First and foremost are the judicial guidelines. So essentially, since we met last, in a very quick update, by far the biggest element of all your insurance premiums, be they public liability or employer liability, is the cost of claims, specifically damages handed out to plaintiffs. It is by far the biggest element. And so any reform process which doesn't address this would essentially be ignoring the elephant in the sitting room. Government agreed on this, and in the course of the last government and following up in the current one, the Judicial Council was established. One of its roles is to set judicial guidelines for awards for personal injury, and they, I think, exceeded the expectations of many commentators when the judiciary delivered a set of guidelines which showed dramatic reductions on minor injuries, in particular the slips, trips and falls, which absolutely are the scourge of the retail trade. The ones that in other countries might get an apology on a voucher, and in this country cost 20 or 30,000 euro. They have signalled dramatic reductions in the awards to be handed out for those sort of injuries. Now we're in the early days. They were implemented on the 24th of April of last year, and PIAB is the first step with the vast majority of claims, the Personal Injuries Assessment Board, and they have certainly taken these new guidelines to heart. And the latest update, which was mentioned by the Taoiseach at the start of this month, is that up to the end of November, on average, they are assessing awards at 50% lower than prior to these new guidelines. So with the old book of quantum. Now, that should have a profound impact on insurance premiums, and I'll get onto that a little bit further down the road. But there are a couple of caveats to that. First is that there were 15, that we know of, 15 constitutional challenges to the new guidelines. The legal profession will not let go of this gravy train for love nor money if they can avoid it. So plaintiffs are being marched into the High Court on the back of constitutional challenges to the judicial guidelines. There's a lead case being heard in the High Court next week. 6 days have been set aside by Justice Meenan, and we'll be a lot wiser following the decision in that case. It doesn't mean that if the guidelines are upheld, that it won't go to the Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court, but certainly we'd be a lot clearer on the direction of thinking of the judiciary once that happens. So there's the legal challenges that inevitably the new guidelines are facing. The second step is the attitude of insurers towards the new guidelines. So the vast majority, in value terms, 84% of liability claims are settled in private deals between insurers and lawyers. So the claim goes to PIAB, it's rejected by the plaintiff, typically 90% of cases, and then goes to litigation. But the vast majority of those cases never see the inside of a courtroom. They're settled. And the settlement strategy of insurers has been poor, in our view, over the last number of decades, in the sense that as a financial expedient, they will settle claims even when they're manifestly unjust, if there's a short-term financial gain. So essentially, for those of you who are very involved in claims management, if they reserve 75,000 all in for a slip or a trip, including legal fees, and they feel that they can get away with 50 all in, then they'll go for it. It doesn't matter if it was faked or wildly exaggerated, they will still go for it. We would expect them, given these new guidelines, to hold firm. We haven't got any data yet. It'll certainly be October of this year when the next National Claims Information Database on motor insurance comes out, that we'll get some sort of indication of what they're doing. I am slightly concerned. I got a phone call yesterday from a key legal affairs journalist who has been ringing round barristers and solicitors that they would know very well, and has rung quite a few, according to their own words, and says that universally what they're saying is that insurers, when they're faced with a claim which is rejected at PIAB, are adding on a few bob and settling. Now, that might seem like a fair enough approach, except that what it does is fundamentally undermine PIAB and fundamentally undermine the guidelines, because there's an incentive from a plaintiff's point of view to proceed to litigation, even if they're only getting £1,000 extra. But critically, in the background, lawyers go from getting an average of about €1,600 for a public liability claim in legal fees through PIAB to over €16,000 when it's litigated and before it gets to court. So there's an enormous jump in the cost of claims, and it's you and your businesses that are funding that gap. So we have made it very clear to insurers and to government that we expect them to hold firm and not to settle as a financial expedient. The final piece in the jigsaw is the judiciary themselves. They voted and have now collectively adopted the new guidelines. That's not to say that individual judges won't attempt to breach them, as they are constitutionally entitled to do. But we won't know an awful lot about that and how that works out for probably another year or so. We're waiting to see the first of the cases under the new guidelines finally hitting the courts before we can start to draw any conclusions on that. So we've come quite a way on the cost of claims, but we have quite some way to go. In terms of duty of care, which is a key issue within the retail trade, essentially, as many of you will know, if an incident happens on your premises, you are often absolutely responsible, regardless of the circumstances, when it comes to the decision of the courts or often the settlement strategy of insurers. And that's not sustainable. We've been campaigning since day one for a rebalancing of the duty of care, and we certainly have got traction with Minister McEntee. And we understand that after a very long delay, partially due to the deliberations of the Attorney General, that we are certainly government is going to see proposals in this area very, very soon, and we would expect them to be publicised very soon after. So I will be getting in touch with Duncan as soon as those guidelines are publicly available, to seek feedback from members who are experienced in this area. The devil is going to be in the detail. If you go back to the 95 Act, which rules this area, the wording on first reading seems very reasonable, but it has been undone by the attitude of certain of the judiciary over the years. So the wording is going to need to be a lot more watertight, and we'll be looking for as many opinions as possible when that wording is available. In terms of the Personal Injuries Assessment Board, I'm actually in Sligo, as Duncan mentioned. I'm at the annual conference of Ireland's Association for Adventure Tourism, and I was asked to say that I'm in the Sligo Park Hotel because they've kindly given me a room for this presentation. And one of the questions that I was asked at their conference was, is PIAB a help or a hindrance when it comes to the cost of insurance? And my answer to that is qualified as follows. The idea of PIAB is an exceptionally good idea, and there is a path beaten to the door of PIAB by governments from other countries coming to look at how it operates, because it is a really good idea. It essentially gets compensation to people who deserve it quickly and cheaply. However, it takes legal fees out of the process as part of that. And so it has been subject to so many legal challenges that it is fundamentally flawed at this stage. And it is in danger of being reduced to just a scorekeeper, keeping a record of the claims and the value of the damages. And that can't be allowed to happen. So Minister of State Robert Troy had drafted some fairly ambitious plans. They've been watered down over a consultation process, primarily due to a Supreme Court challenge to the Workplace Relations Commission, which has clearly restricted their movement or space for movement over the last while. But the bill that he's preparing is not a bad bill, and we would expect it to certainly make a contribution, if not a dramatic contribution, to the reduction of costs when it comes to personal injury claims. We would certainly support it with a certain number of reservations. and we have sought to make a presentation to the Enterprise Committee when they're having a look at the draft legislation. So we will be more or less supporting that new legislation. There's a Garda unit in place now to deal with insurance fraud. It's based at the National Economic Crime Bureau on Harcourt Street. The Alliance has developed a memorandum of understanding with this new unit. And so for anyone who's self-insured or for anyone who has a case they wish to make a complaint about but cannot get the cooperation of their insurer in making a complaint, there is now a way of getting directly to a unit within An Garda Síochána who specialise in insurance fraud and will give a reasonable assessment of a case if a complaint is made. Now, the Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, is quite a detailed one. It's not for the faint-hearted. You would certainly need a resource within the business which is familiar with fraudulent claims and capable of filling in the detail, because to a certain extent the Gardaí are looking for the case to be proven before it even gets to them. Having said that, it's a huge improvement on what was there previously, where there was no formal route to making a complaint on insurance reform, and essentially people with a file load of information, including CCTV footage and or private detective information, were left sitting in the reception or the lobby of Garda stations all over the country trying to find someone to listen to them. That's gone. We now have a unit, a very, very small unit, but a unit nonetheless, that specialise in this area. And I would encourage anyone who suspects fraud and has a degree of evidence that they can provide to prove that suspected fraud, to engage either through your insurer or directly. And feel free to contact me if you need any steer on that. So, I said on slide 1 that the Alliance was established in order to get the cost of motor and liability insurance down to affordable levels and to keep it that way. And all of the work that we've done over the last 4 years and the huge support of Retail Excellence and other members will be for nothing if we don't get sustainable insurance costs in this country. And are we getting them? Well, as Duncan has already highlighted, there's a fork in the road here as well. So what has happened is that on motor insurance, we're looking at reductions according to our own survey. We have a 1-minute survey ongoing within the Alliance, and it's on our website, and we post it regularly on social media as well. And it takes about 1.5 minutes to complete. But according to that survey, motor insurance premiums are trending downwards by about 9%. And all of the things being equal, if you don't get a reduction of there or thereabouts on renewal, then you have good cause to take issue with your current insurer, and in any case shop around, because as we now know, all the algorithms within insurers are designed to penalise people who display loyalty. So it is critical that you do on motor, but all other things being equal, we're looking at an average reduction of 9%. However, on liability insurance, we're trending at plus 16. And in our view, that divergence is caused by the fact that there is very healthy competition on motor. There are plenty of insurers established in the sector. They're all looking for your business. Whether it's on radio or TV right now, there are tons of ads looking for your motor and home insurance increasingly. And that's a very positive thing. But that's on the back of the reforms that we've managed to get over the line. So essentially every premium is calculated on the basis of future risk. And on motor, the level of damages is on the way down. The Garda Insurance Fraud Unit is established. There's a new Perjury Act has been commenced as well. And we've got a very strong indication that we're going to see duty of care rebalanced and PIAB reformed, and that has been reflected in the premiums. The problem from our perspective is that on liability insurance there isn't enough competition, and whilst there are still plenty of underwriters in the market despite Brexit and despite the pandemic, they very often specialise in very niche sectors, And so the experience of our members is that they can either get one quote or no quote. And when you're in a situation like that, you're in serious trouble, because they'll call it whatever they want, to market forces or just the way it is. But essentially, as soon as you go from two underwriters to one underwriter, your premium rockets. And it's as simple as that. It's competition. And we need additional competition in the market. And I'll return to that in 1 minute. The second and increasing challenge within the liability side of things is availability. And we have a real issue here. We're currently tracking at 44 sectors or subsectors that either cannot get cover at all or are reduced to one underwriter with that built-in vulnerability. And some of them are extremely vulnerable sectors and sectorally very important from an economic point of view. So it's not just the ones that gather all the headlines, like the bouncy castles, the play centres, the adventure centres, but the childcare sector has only one underwriter at the moment. I don't need to explain to you what would happen if that underwriter made a strategic decision to get out of the market, and that's a vulnerability that we cannot afford as a society. The same applies in many of the private health sectors as well, and voluntary health sectors. So we need to get away from a situation where there's only one underwriter, and there is an enormous role for government in that. They've acknowledged that availability and competition are part of their responsibility. They've established an insurance competition office to address just this. It's been in place since December 2020, and we have not seen any significant developments on the back of that office. Now, we met Minister Sean Fleming about this specific issue yesterday. His department tell us that they've now briefed the IDA and produced a brochure, and the IDA have identified quite a number of potential targets around the world, underwriters that they feel would come into Ireland. Certainly now their job is made easier by all the improvements and the reforms that have happened or are happening. We think that it's a very good time to start underwriting in Ireland, because you don't carry all of the baggage of the old book of quantum, and you are going into a market which is quite hard, which offers great margins to insurers, in a situation where the outlook for insurers is improving dramatically. So we feel this is a very good time to sell Ireland as a destination for underwriters, and it's really a matter of them getting the finger out and doing this really quickly, because there are just too many sectors that are vulnerable right now. In terms of other issues, some of the members challenged me at times and say that legal costs should be right up at the top of the list. And in reality, it should, because it has two impacts on the sector. First of all, the legal costs per se are an enormous penalty on anyone who's seeking justice in this country, not just in the personal injury sector, but right across the range. Ireland is a judicial setup which is only really available to millionaires and paupers, as one of the ex-presidents of the High Court once said. It is not affordable for the vast majority of people, and it's not affordable for the vast majority of businesses either, and so it needs to be addressed. There is a secondary element which is equally important. There's an enormous incentive for lawyers to get cases to litigation. PIAB is a real irritation because it doesn't provide in general for legal fees. So it's really important for lawyers that they get a case to litigation with all of the additional costs and time delays and uncertainty that entails. So as the system currently stands, it is set up to get personal injury claims into litigation, and that's not acceptable. So there are two pots of gold at the end of the rainbow in Ireland when it comes to personal injury. There's the pot of gold that pays out damages at hugely inflated levels for minor injuries, and there's the pot of gold that pays out the legal fees, and both of those need to be addressed. The reason that I haven't put this issue top of the list is because the Troika came in here in 2010 and very quickly instructed the government to get legal fees sorted, and 11 years later they haven't. So if the Troika can't do it, then what are the chances? Now, there's a bit of light at the end of the tunnel at the moment. The current Minister for Justice, Helen McEntee, who coincidentally is not a lawyer, has commissioned a report on the capping of legal fees. It's been carried out by Indicon. We made a comprehensive submission to Indicon, and the report is due to get into the Department of Justice by June. We'll await and see what happens after that. It will be the mother of all battles to get a cap on legal fees in the Circuit Court and High Court, as they currently are in the District Court. But we wait and see what's going to happen. Who replaces, if the current minister isn't in justice after the reshuffle in December, who replaces her is going to be absolutely critical to this. So there are plenty of question marks over this line of reform. Complaints regarding legal practitioners have now been taken over by the Legal Services Regulatory Authority. It's no secret that the previous regime, where the Law Society handled complaints about solicitors, led to a belief among the public that there was no point in putting in a complaint about solicitor because their peers were going to review it and chuck it out, except in very extreme circumstances. We shall wait and see what happens with the LSRA. They have 9 complaints pending from the Alliance. They have many, many more complaints pending from other sources. We haven't got resolution on any of the complaints yet. And so there is a time issue, and we've already suggested in a review of the LSRA that they need to put timelines in place for these reviews, because you could drag it out until you're retired, the way it's looking at the moment. But certainly we're active in this area, and where we see egregious advertising or we see egregious behaviour in a personal injury case, we will flag it to the LSRA. There are a lot of very strong feelings about an insurance fraud database. Clearly, insurers can't operate properly if they don't know who the frequent and fraudulent claimants are. There is a database at the moment. It's held by Insurance Ireland. The European Commission has deemed that to be anti-competitive, and have put out a set of proposals in conjunction with Insurance Ireland on how to resolve that issue. The submissions on this are due in 2 weeks' time, and again we'll be putting in a comprehensive submission on that, and we expect the insurance claims database, which it is, to be widely available to anyone who's interested in coming into this market in future. Are there any questions at that stage, just to put a pause on matters? Duncan, has anything popped up yet?
Nothing's popped up yet, Peter, but I've got one or two that you might just maybe pick this one up, because I know that obviously throughout the pandemic we had all the discussions around business interruption claims and so forth. Where does that now stand? Because clearly there was payouts there for the publicans there a few months ago, but what's the story on that, and is there any hope of that changing at all, or what's the situation currently?
Okay, so yeah, it's good, very good question. So there were 2 routes to pursuing a business interruption claim. Typically, insurers just said a blanket no, and what we found to be very poor form was that brokers were handing out the blanket no's on behalf of underwriters when they're supposed to be representing their clients. But what we saw during the early stages of the pandemic was that brokers were saying, no, you haven't a chance. And then it was up to the client to pursue it further, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. But we don't believe that there was sufficient assessment of the actual potential for a claim by brokers. So there are 2 routes where you got no satisfaction. The first was for businesses with a turnover under 3 million, which is through the Ombudsman, the FSPO. And the second was for businesses with a turnover over 3 million, which is through the courts, which, as I've mentioned already, is an eye-wateringly expensive route. Um, the ombudsman route has been quite productive. Quite a few businesses have got compensation as a result. Others have been told that no, they're not entitled to it. It's really down to the reading of the policy, and policies are so different. For anyone who's still engaged in this area, the Ombudsman published a report involving analysis of, I think, 12 different policies with a view to determining whether they were entitled to business interruption cover due to the pandemic. And so it gives a useful insight. It doesn't cover every policy wording, but it certainly gives a useful insight. When it comes to the courts, there have been a number of cases. Some have won, some have lost. I feel very sorry for the publicans. The 4 publicans in particular have only got interim payments, and over 2 years later are still slogging through the unbelievably expensive process of going through the High Court. Now, it's been agreed that the insurers will cover their costs eventually, but at what level remains to be seen. Despite the fact that everyone now agrees that they're entitled to compensation, they're spending a huge amount of their time in and out of court. And have only got an interim payment so far. So it's been a very difficult process for them. And we don't believe that the insurers have behaved as well as they should have in the circumstances. So it's certainly not a process for the faint-hearted.
It's interesting, isn't it? I wonder, almost what you're saying is kind of don't go there, isn't it? In terms of unless you want to get embroiled in detailed work and a lot of time as well as cost, by the sounds of it.
Well, the first thing to do is get a very good piece of advice on the wording. And I know we have some terrific help in this area through Dorothea Dowling, who's an insurance expert, and so she has helped us a lot in this area, and as part of a broader research project. And so that line of inquiry is still open if it's still of interest to any members.
Okay. Are there any other questions? If you've got any other questions, please pop them into the chat box and we'll bring them up with Peter.
Okay, I'll fly through the last few slides.
Please do.
I'm having a look now into the future. The near future is reasonably predictable, and so there are a couple of key elements to this. I'm going to give an honorary mention to social media on this. I have been astounded by how powerful Twitter in particular has been in this area. It's an evolving situation still, but politicians and civil servants are incredibly engaged on Twitter in particular. Now, Twitter is a cesspool when it comes to commentary. Again, it's not for the faint-hearted. I have to try and rebalance my thoughts every evening after I come off it, because cripes, you wouldn't want to take a lot of the commentary that's out there too seriously. But in among all of that are some serious nuggets, and I think the Alliance has carved out a niche for itself in terms of credible, honest and serious analysis of the issues and commentary associated with that. And we get it back constantly from individual politicians who have seen our posts, occasionally engage with them, although they're very careful about engagement as opposed to reading. And also from civil servants who will never engage. But I think Duncan is familiar with the story I've told before about putting up a tweet on a specific issue about 2.5 years ago, and then about a half an hour later getting a call from a civil servant who had read the comment at their desk, got up out of their office, grabbed their mobile phone and their coat, walked out of the office, down the stairs, out through the lobby of their building and across the road to the local park, and called me from there to confidentially say that that was a really powerful comment and it was a point that needed to be made. So we are being watched even when we don't know that we're being watched. And needless to say, politicians being politicians, the more comments and the more retweets for a particular tweet from the Alliance, the more credibility and weight it has. So I would certainly, I would never expect members to engage with every post. Some of our posts will be too obtuse for their audience or too detailed. Some just won't be relevant at all. Others may be a little bit strong for some members, depending on their line on social media and the tone of voice that they adopt. But where tweets suit you, I would encourage you to engage as often as you can. To be honest, what we found is that liking it doesn't matter an awful lot. But if you retweet it or you make a comment on it, that's where the money lies. So going forward, that's going to be particularly important. Stories, likewise. We thought at the very early stages that because we came in on a crisis that already existed, and we thought that politicians knew all the stories, but they don't, and they still hoover them up. And at the end of the day, I'm a suit, and in a meeting with a minister and or civil servants, I'm going to get about 15 to 20 minutes of their attention before they start drifting on to the next meeting. And that's being optimistic. Whereas if I have someone with me who can tell a story about the way that it has impacted directly on their business or their voluntary group, that keeps them engaged. Now, the good news from a point of view of our membership is that the ones that really get them going are charities, voluntary groups and sports organisations. And we have huge engagement on that side. And that has been a big help. So in areas where we mightn't get much traction because we're a lot of our members are commercial organisations, the voluntary and community groups have stepped up to the mark and have really moved the agenda forward. And it's with stories that they get that engagement. You know, my premium 5 years ago was 10,000 and now it's 120,000. That's very, very compelling stuff, and I hear it all the time. In the immediate future, one of our roles is to stop a premature ministerial victory parade. It is becoming politically important now for the ministers involved to declare a win on this, because there'll be a reshuffle at the end of this year, and they want to leave with a win under their belt. And so we knew as soon as we started the research that what would happen would be that they would start to engage on motor insurance, because motor insurance has been trending down for a while now on the back of the reforms. We have blocked them from doing that, and at every opportunity we will say, you're getting motor done, but the problem has always been with liability, and that's where the damage has been done. And we will continue to call them to account on that and prevent that premature victory parade. Same applies with brokers, and we've come across 2 or 3 situations recently where brokers have been involved in particularly group deals and wanted to do joint PR. And we haven't a notion of doing that, because essentially when we dig into it, they're tending to put together groups which facilitate insurance, yes, but at a very high level, and we will not tolerate the normalization of high insurance premiums, because essentially what that would do is copper fasten the once-off transfer of revenue from productive sectors like your own and into the insurance sector. Now, it's critical that we have a profitable insurance sector in this country, and we've identified the ways of doing it. But one of them is not to pitch insurance premiums up to scandalous levels. Like I was talking to an adventure business today who are paying 9% of their turnover into insurance costs right now. And that's not sustainable in any business. And so we cannot allow that to be normalized, and we will not allow it to be normalized. I've mentioned group schemes briefly, and I think it's important to give an honorary mention to risk management as well. Increasingly in the last 3 months, the narrative coming from government focuses around these areas. So join together as a group, go to a broker and negotiate a better deal. Get your risk management sorted, work out strategies to mitigate on risk, and therefore reduce the number of claims. Now, the group scheme is fantastic. We fully agree with that. It's not a reform, it's a short-term measure. And typically what we find with group schemes is that they'll get a couple of years of benefit, and then a couple of claims at the higher levels kick in, and the benefit of the group scheme is eroded. On risk management, Ireland is one of the safest countries in Europe. Statistically, the UK's HSE, which is the Health and Safety Executive there, show us top of the league on all of the metrics year in and year out. There is a danger that we will put too much risk management in place. We're all for it. It's absolutely critical, and you owe it as a duty of care to both your employees and your customers that you have optimal risk management. But to try and turn the issue around to policyholders and say that it's about risk management is, in my view, it's like victim blaming, and it's a shameful strategy. And I've seen it on a couple of occasions recently, and we will not tolerate it. We're all for risk management. It was a very big issue on the agenda here with adventure tourism today, and that's fair enough. But don't try and tell us that we're going to resolve this problem through risk management, because Ireland has been managing risk for years and hasn't been getting the rewards. In the longer term, on damages, we would expect damages to drop dramatically. It may take a little bit more time for it to bed in, and certainly it's going to need a lot more attention. Like I said at the start, we won't be leaving the pitch too early this time around. I think if we use the model from 2002, 2003, we'd already be gone at this stage. We cannot leave, because we have to shepherd those damages over the line. On duty of care, we would expect movement on that. There's a process, obviously. Once the proposals are published, you're talking a year to 2 years, and possibly in the absence of Helen McEntee. So there's quite a bit of work involved in shepherding that over the line. On legal fees, who knows what's going to happen, but we will certainly do our very best to make sure that something happens in terms of capping them. Defamation, Duncan has mentioned this already. It's an issue for some members, and there are proposals on defamation. They're very much live. They're in the current legislative programme for spring 2022, and they do include an allowance for retailers and the whole issue of defamation and shoplifting. So we'd be quite positive about what's happening in that area. In the longer term, there will need to be an alliance. There's absolutely no doubt about it. We cannot leave the pitch too early. Eventually it may become a resources issue, and what we're in the process of doing is setting up a working group that will discuss the future of the alliance, and how, when the current model has outlived its usefulness, that there will be some way of making sure that policyholders are always represented at the top table. So that's it from me. I thank everyone for their attention. I hope that's been of interest. Thank again Retail Excellence for the level of engagement that we've had on this issue, and I'd encourage you to make sure that you when you get your next premium, if there is a reduction, that you don't then get up from the table and give up on this, because we have a generational opportunity to make sure that we never have to come back to insurance again, and that we end up with a functioning insurance market for the long term.
Thanks, Peter. That was wonderful and really informative. A couple of questions that have come up. One was around, you mentioned around the complaints regarding legal practitioners, and you mentioned that I think you had some that were either hadn't been processed yet or were in play. What do those look like? Can you give me an example of perhaps the sort of things that are coming up?
Okay, so they fall into two categories. The first is where we come across a claim which is just farcical and is clearly a try-on, and would have looked like a try-on from day one to anyone assessing it from a reasonable point of view. And yet that plaintiff found a solicitor to represent them. Now, in our view, solicitors have an obligation to the court to make sure that what they're presenting is truthful, and that the reasonable person in the street would regard it as truthful. And if they're going through hoops to get a claim into court, despite the fact that there's no basis for it, then solicitors have to take some responsibility for that. So we would have one or two complaints in that area. The other area then is on advertising. And there are a couple of areas here. First of all, no full, no fee advertising is not legal in this country. And yet, if you type in no full, no fee on your laptop in front of you there, you will get page after page of solicitors' websites popping up. And so they've worked a number of ways around it. So rather than saying we offer no full, no fee, they will very often say, we want to explain no full, no fee to you. And then the implication is obviously that's what they're offering. It's not illegal, by the way, to run a case on no full, no fee basis. It's just illegal to advertise it. But there have been a couple of cases recently where they've gone much further than that. And so we've complained about those. We've also complained about articles, primarily online, which are essentially encouraging people to claim. And so they'll identify issues, for example, around COVID-19, or issues. There was one in particular during the pandemic, which targeted retail premises. During COVID-19, they're getting busier. It might be easier to slip, or maybe somebody dropped a litre of milk on your toe or whatever. They weren't the exact words, but there was certainly kind of a fishing expedition on a couple of occasions. And again, that's the kind of stuff that we put in complaints about.
Interesting. And just a couple more, just to finish up. Peter, you mentioned there around the lack of underwriters in the Irish market, yeah, and you talked in terms of the need to get more, attract more of them in, and that this was probably a good time. Has Brexit played a part there in terms of, I mean, are these underwriters that we're trying to attract in the UK, or are they further out in Europe? And you know, where would you say we should be going as a country to attract this competition into the Irish economy?
Yeah, Brexit really didn't help, and whilst the underwriters and brokers who left didn't ensure a huge segment of the market, they were very often very specialized, and they were the only underwriter covering particular niche sectors. So Brexit has had a disproportionate effect. And essentially what now has to happen, if say you run a hang gliding business and there's an underwriter in London, very probably based in Lloyd's, who is the only underwriter for hang gliding in this neck of the woods, then you're going to have to persuade them to come back, which means that they have to set up an office in Dublin, a physical office, because they have to have a physical presence within the EU. And it might be more profitable for that underwriter to set up a second office in Manchester, which gets them access to the same size market, but there's no currency complications, there's no legislative complications, and they could probably do it with a much smaller office. And so that is most definitely a complication. However, there are insurers in the rest of Europe. Now, obviously they have issues in that we have a common law jurisdiction, which is now virtually unique in the EU. And continental underwriters tend to struggle with the mad logic of the common law system when it comes to personal injury claims. So there's a bit of reassurance and hand-holding involved in bringing somebody from France or Germany or wherever into this market. But one of the issues which has popped up recently is that other common law jurisdictions like Australia and Canada might be worth a look as well. And certainly that's something that government has taken on board. That was a suggestion from Brokers Ireland, and they are looking at that. They are looking at mainland Europe, and they are looking at London, where they can provide a big enough pot. So I'll give you a very quick example. I don't want to delay anybody, but probably the most perfect example we've seen of it so far is the play centres, PALI, Play Activity and Leisure Ireland. They're up there on the screen. And that was an organisation, a representative body that was established because all their members were about to go out of business because their insurance premiums rocketed. And they got together, they worked out a way of confidentially gathering all the information in terms of premiums on one side and claims pending on the other. And it turned out that they had a combined premium of $1 million a year, or 5 million over 5 years, which is kind of an insurance cycle. And in that insurance cycle of 5 years, there was a 5 million premium and a 1 million payout. So there was clearly a chunk of fat there, which some insurer might be interested in. And on the back of that, they got cover from London. They had only one underwriter in the first year, and they had 5 bidding for the business in year 2. I think this year it might have been 4 or 3, but you know, it does come and go, but it just shows the value. And really 1 million typically seems to be the magic word. Once you get to that level, you start to get attention from abroad, and that can be very useful. So there is hope. If I had been asked to sell Ireland as an insurance destination 3 years ago, I would have said no, because it was a basket case. We were well aware of that, but with the reforms that have happened and the ones that are pending, I think there's a good news story to tell.
Yeah, so there's hope at the end, light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
The final thing before I let you go, and I know you've done some fantastic work, and this is the second variation, let's call it, of the Alliance. But you know, if you have to mark yourself out of 10 at this point, Peter, I'll put you on the spot. Where would you mark yourself? 2 or 4 years into the second round, where would you be?
Well, I'm going to deflect it, and I'm going to use the sporting analogy to do that. I would say if we were in an All Ireland final, and it has that significance, that there are 5 minutes to go and we're 2 points up.
Okay.
And that's an incredibly dangerous place to be. And so I'd be as optimistic as a supporter of a team that's 2 points up with 5 minutes to go. So that's why we won't be leaving the pitch. And there's an enormous amount of work to do yet. I do think that if we left any time in the near future, that the reforms would be eaten alive, and we can't afford for that to happen.
Great stuff. Listen, Peter, thank you very much for today. Peter Boland, the Alliance of Insurance Reform. And if anybody here has got any queries or any issues around insurance, please leave them through to us and we'll pass them on to Peter, and we'll create more stories for you, Peter, for the future.
Great stuff.
Great stuff. Thanks a million. Bye now. Bye.